Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Caitlin and I upload 3 times a week on this channel. Wednesdays are fashion and lifestyle videos, Fridays are weekly university vlogs of my life at university, and Sundays are my Unsolved Sundays where I discuss some sort of true crime, mystery, disappearance, murder, anything along those lines. I'm going to be discussing a technically solved case because I've had a bunch of requests from you guys asking me to do like a mixture of solved and unsolved cases, so that's what I'm doing today. Today we're discussing the murder of Amber Creek, and I'm going to go through everything you need to know about the case, so we shall just get started. So Amber's story is absolutely heartbreaking. I was just heartbroken like from the get-go. It's just awful, her story. So Amber Creek was born on the 2nd of July 1982 in Park Ridge, Illinois. In her early life she lived with her mother, who it turned out she had a very strong cocaine addiction. Not only that, but a few years down the line people discovered that her mum's boyfriend at the time was actually a paedophile. When Amber was only 6 years old, she shared the story and she told people about the abuse that she'd suffered at the hands of her mother and her mother's boyfriend. So she was immediately taken out of their care and then she moved in with her father. Now her father lived in a place called Palatine, Illinois, I think, so it was less than a half an hour drive away, so it wasn't far, but she went to live with her father, whose name was Robert. Considering the rough early start that she had with her mother and her mother's boyfriend, how they treated her, she began to grow up without any signs of any scarring. She basically appeared to have a normal childhood until she reached the age of about 14, when she began to show signs of psychological damage. When Amber turned 14, she began to suffer from severe depression and she began to turn to self-damaging behaviours, like she would sneak out at night, she would run away and then obviously return home. She would turn to alcohol, drugs and sex just as a self-damaging behaviour because obviously she'd suffered such a rough childhood. In December of 1996, Amber was recommended by her therapist to start a residential therapy course. So that's basically just a rehab course, just to stop these self-damaging behaviours, to hopefully get her the help she needed, because traditional therapy methods weren't really working. But unfortunately, Robert, her father, could not afford the money. It was a lot of money to start a therapy course like that, and he just couldn't afford it, and unfortunately the state couldn't provide the therapy or pay for the therapy for Amber because she was deemed as being in adequate care with Robert, so there was no way that she was going to get this therapy through either of those means. And as a result of this, Robert, her father, made a very difficult decision in a desperate last-ditch attempt to get Amber the help that she needed. He dropped Amber off at the local police station and told all of the authorities there that he could no longer take care of her, ultimately forcing her into the care of the state. Due to her being the property of the state, she could hopefully be given the therapy and the help that she could need to save her life. Things didn't quite go this way, and Amber was unfortunately not able to be placed in a foster home. No one would foster her, most likely because of her age. It becomes more and more unlikely, like statistically, that you will get fostered the older you get. So she ended up being placed in a Chicago youth centre. Basically it's just a group home for kids who needed care. But her time in this youth centre was short. Within the first 6 weeks of being placed there, she ran away 9 times. And on each of these times, no one knew where she would go, but she would always return back to the youth centre after a few days. This all changed on January the 23rd, 1997, when Amber ran away from the Chicago youth centre and never returned. From here, 14-year-old Amber was homeless and she ended up turning to prostitution as a means of survival and getting money. On February 1st, 1997, Amber was known to attend a party in a city in Illinois called Rolling Meadows. She attended this party. It was in a really dingy hotel and she was with a group of unidentified men, so they know her whereabouts, they just don't know who she was with. She was reported being seen leaving this party at the end of the night with an unidentified man, and after this point she was never seen alive again. On February 9th, 1997, 2 men were hunting near a marsh in the Karcher Wildlife Area in Burlington, Wisconsin, and this is when they came across a body of a young girl frozen up against a tree. Her arm had been raised above her head as though she was waving at them, and her palm was outstretched with the word "Hi" written in black marker on her palm. There was a price tag with $5 written on it that was attached to her arm when they found her, and they discovered that before her death she had been beaten and raped. Her killer had used a plastic rubbish bag to suffocate her, and the bag was still left over her head when her body was discovered. When the investigators arrived on the scene and they removed the plastic bag from her head, they actually discovered a really brutal and aggressive human bite mark on the side of her neck. She was also found to be naked from the waist down. It wasn't until a little while later that they actually discovered the trousers she had been wearing in a car park not far from where she was found, and whoever had removed those trousers had balled up her underwear and stuffed it into the pocket. So unfortunately, when they discovered this body, they were unable to correctly identify it as being Amber Creek. And this was because the youth centre that she was supposed to be living in had failed to report her missing until 5 weeks after she'd run away. And then when they did eventually file a missing persons report, they actually provided authorities with the wrong photograph of the wrong girl. So Amber Creek was a name in the system with a different face to her. Due to their inability to identify her correctly, she was buried in a donated casket under a gravestone with Jane Doe written on it, and around 100 locals in the area actually attended her funeral, as well as all the police and authorities, because so many people in the area had been touched by this nameless girl's story. A year later, the TV show America's Most Wanted actually aired the story of Jane Doe at the time, and this was when Robert, her father, was actually watching the episode and was able to correctly identify her as being Amber. And because of this correct identification, also in conjunction with DNA and dental records, Amber was later reburied under her correct name. So in terms of the investigation into the perpetrator and whoever killed Amber, there were very few leads to follow up on. The case eventually went cold, and the police remained adamant that she had been killed by one of her clients, but unfortunately other than that they didn't really have any leads to follow. 17 years after Amber's murder in February 2014, investigators in Oklahoma were reviewing old cold case fingerprints. They were running through the system to see if there were any updates, and they actually found a match to a thumbprint that they'd found on the rubbish bag found over Amber's head. They were previously unable to identify who the thumbprint belonged to because the thumbprint hadn't been on the system, but they found a match of a man who had entered the system just a few years later. The match sent them to a 36-year-old man named James Eaton, who was a resident of Palatine, Illinois, which is obviously where Amber and her father had originally lived. At the time of Amber's murder, he had only been 19 years old and his fingerprints hadn't entered the system yet. It wasn't until 2000 when his fingerprints were entered the system when he was arrested on drug possession charges. Due to this being the only information they had to link James to the murder, they needed a little bit more solid evidence, so they ended up just completing this whole covert operation where they ended up tailing him for weeks, just trying to find more DNA evidence to make a stronger case. They ended up collecting some old used cigarette butts that he threw away outside a train station, and in April of 2014 James Eaton was arrested and charged for the murder of Amber Creek and of concealing her body. He never confessed to the crime, and he actually then pleaded not guilty in a trial in October of 2014. And then on October 25th, 2016, he entered a plea of no contest in order to receive a reduced charge to his original charge of first-degree reckless homicide. Because of this plea, he was then facing up to 40 years in prison as opposed to an immediate life sentence, and then he was sentenced to the full 40 years on January 20th, 2017. So that was the case, or the entire case of Amber Creek's murder and the trial of James Eaton, kind of summarised. The main reason I wanted to discuss this was because it was kind of more recent, so obviously he was only eventually charged in 2017, however many years it was after the murder. So obviously I know some people are going to be a bit like, oh, what's the point in this video, it's a solved case, but that's kind of what I wanted to discuss, how many turns there were and how many different breaks it took and how long of a time span it took them to find the man and eventually charge him with 40 years in prison, which I actually think personally is crazy that he managed to only get 40 years instead of a life sentence, but obviously I'm not a judge. But yeah, that's the case I wanted to discuss. Let me know your thoughts down below, whether you think that he deserved more years in prison, whether you think there was more they could have done in the investigation. I think it was just almost like a lucky break. Obviously I don't know whether there's things they missed out or things they could have handled better, but obviously James Eaton hadn't entered the system, or the fingerprint system, until years later, so who knows. Some people argue that perhaps he isn't the correct guy. Yes, let me know your thoughts down below and any other cases you want me to discuss in future weeks' videos, and I will see you guys soon for another video. Bye.